So, listeners, after seeing the title of this episode, I definitely know the demand you're asking of us. Go ahead, make my day. And hopefully we will, because we are talking the new movie Juror number 2 and the career of its director, Clint Eastwood, as a director. This is Alex from Los Angeles.
And this is Karen from Los Angeles. Welcome to Movies That Shaped Us. We're two longtime friends who grew up on opposite ends of the globe with very different backgrounds, but were both shaped and are still being shaped by the movies we see and love. In each episode, we cover a filmmaker who shaped our love of movies. Join us as we explore why they matter and review the 3 movies in their filmography that have made the biggest impact on us. This is a big one. Again, I feel like we've been doing some like old masters back to back. It's
That's right.
sort of that time of the year, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is a big one too, because Clint Eastwood is not only one of the most famous movie stars of all time, but he has a very long and career and behind the camera as well, starting out in the early 70s. He's made over, I think, 30 films now. He's got a
Yeah.
very long and varied filmography. We could be doing a whole separate episode, and maybe at one point we will, on Clint the actor. But just to let listeners know, like this episode, we're focusing on Clint as a director. And maybe I'll start that on my Clint thought. I guess I have to mention, just as an actor, he is one of my favorite actors. I came to him
Uh-huh.
later in my life. Actually, it wasn't until right after college I sort of discovered and fell in love with Clint Eastwood. I'd always been aware of him, but it wasn't like I was watching his movies growing up. Like I was much more of like a Harrison Ford, Alt Schwarzenegger 80s kid, right?
Mhm.
Not so much into Clint, and didn't really get into Westerns until later. So it definitely came to me a lot later in life. So actually, I saw his films as a director without him even being in it first. And we'll talk about one of those when we cover it. But as a director, he is someone too that initially, I'm always skeptical of actor directors. Is it a vanity project? Or are they just trying to get their own acting career going in a bigger way, and they don't like people telling them what to do behind the camera, so they're going to step behind and give the performances they want to give? Like that's sometimes can fall into those situations. Or you have a lot of times like Woody Allen, someone else we already covered on this season actually, who is a writer director actor. So he writes and then he puts himself in the movies and then he directs too, and that's a whole other game. But Eastwood to me is interesting because he's not a writer. I don't know if he's ever contributed to any of his screenplays, I'm not sure. And a lot of
I
his
don't think
movies,
so.
especially later in his career, don't have him in it, or have like, a surrogate, oh, I could have played this role if I was younger kind of thing. He has a very specific type of story that he likes to tell. And he's been telling that for, again, 30 years now. And what I've sort of grown to love about Clint is the types of movies and the plot lines and the situations that he covers are very interesting. They seem to always revolve around some sort of moral question of right and wrong, and it's never a clear answer to that. There isn't like a right and wrong in Clint's world. Everything is a mixture of the two. There are sometimes good people do bad things, bad people do good things. I think that what makes him in a way like one of the most humanist directors we have, and someone who puts so much empathy into all of his characters, whether they're good people or bad people, that I find just incredibly fascinating. I mean, sometimes, especially when he's in the movie, he puts that behind a facade of this masculinity that he portrays as an actor. And sometimes I think people are get swept up in that piece of it and don't really go deeper in terms of examining what the themes of these movies are. But I love that Clint seems to be wrestling with this his entire career. Like I've gone back and I've not seen all of his films. I'll just say that at the outset, but probably about 75% of his filmography as a director. And he's been dealing with this one way or another for a long time. Again, even dating back to the 70s. And really, like the last 10 years, I think that's been the focal point of all of his films, really, of like some moral question about what do you do in this situation? Do you judge people for their actions or who they are as people? Those are very fascinating questions, and I love that he seems to be wrestling with this and gives no easy answers in any of his films. Like I think there is not an answer to that question, so I find him fascinating. A lot of other things interesting about how he directs, but I'm curious to have you jump in here on your history of Clint.
Yeah, I was aware of him as well for the longest time, and but this is not somebody who made it to India growing up that much. I sort of remember when the $1 million baby year was happening. That's when I heard this name like a lot, but I had
Mm.
not seen any of his movies like properly. I'm pretty sure there was something running on TV, but I guess I can't remember a time when I've not known him as a cowboy in my head. Like
Ah, so
that
he's
image
cowboy to
has
you.
sort of been,
Hmm.
yeah, that image has been in my head for the longest time. But I came to his movies much later in life. And like you, I think I came to his movies as a director first and then sort of watched a lot of other stuff. And, listeners who've been following us, they know like Westerns have been a bit of a blind spot for me. It's something that I really want to get into. Thanks to this podcast and you, I've sort of discovered Western. There's so much catching up that I have to do, but one in particular was a great entry point for me, and that's a movie that we'll talk about today and we talked about in the past because it's really a masterpiece. But yeah, I think it's interesting. Like his own persona as an actor can often put you at arm's length in terms of the kind of subject matter he might deal with as a director or the kind of director he might be. And going in cold, I was like, oh yeah, his movies are probably all sort of macho and uber masculine or maybe stereotypical in terms of the good and the bad, but it's the total opposite to your point. Like these are all very humanistic stories about people just making choices, good or bad. And what I love about his storytelling technique, technically, but also just emotionally, is that there's very little judgment. It's sort of
Hmm.
left to you as an audience member to kind of figure out to your point of what do you make of this? And those are the best kind of stories because not only are they humanistic, but they're also great movie watching experiences because they spark conversation, right? Like you leave the theater talking about this with whoever you were watching a movie with. People might have different points of views, different takes on who's in the right, who's in the wrong. And it's also, I think, adds to the longevity of the movie because you want to think about it more and more, right? And a lot of his movies that really work, they do plant a seed, in your head. Of course, somebody like him, like Buddy, and all the people that we mentioned who made lots of movies, not all of his movies work for
Right.
sure, but the ones
Right.
that do, they really hit hard. I think the other thing which you're sort of hinting at is that he's very interested in systems,
Hmm.
and people at the behest of these systems, which presents a larger canvas to the story. Because you could kind of put these stories aside as just like humanistic pieces, which are totally valid. But I think what elevates them and even grounds them is that they're often happening in a larger system. It just adds more layers, more context. And then you would think as somebody who's very much about interested in like character and people interaction, and though all of those things are captured beautifully and people have given some of their best performances in Clint Eastwood movies, they're also great set pieces in his movies often, and we'll get into some of those in the movies that we've picked today. And also I think he really loves the cities or towns that he shoots a movie in. Like the movies that really work, they have a great classic, or the city or the town is like third character in the movie or the fourth character in the movies saying. Like that applies to a lot of his movies. Like you feel transported because often his movies are set in places where a lot of movies aren't. So it's a bit of a novelty that, oh, what is happening in this southern town? How do people look like and what do they talk about? Where do they eat at? Like he kind of captures the milieu and the texture of the place as well, which is what all great directors do, right? Like they help you transport. So yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of his. I would say more as a director than as an actor, only because I've watched more movies of his as a director. But I'm grateful that he's had such an amazing career, continues to kind of churn out movies, and kind of had a bit of a reclaiming in pop culture, especially after like the chair incident and what have you.
I think you make some interesting points. So on the location thing, I agree. Like it's very transportive, but not in the way where we did a travel episode, right? And a lot of the locations we picked in that episode were big European cities
Yeah,
or
they're
New
not
York, and
glamorous places.
he goes to normal, everyday America
Yep.
and shows I'm not using this as a pejorative, just the banality of it and the
Yeah.
blandness of it. I mean, that is the majority of the world. I mean, I'm just talking about the United States, are not New York or London or Rome or Paris. There's these just very normal, very basic, non-interesting just towns. Like in America, it's like, okay, there's a Walmart, there's a Jack in the Box, and that's about it. Maybe there's a Home Depot. That's the majority of America. And he goes to those places and doesn't like criticize that or say that's a bad thing. It's like, hey, this is what it is. And the style that he shoots in is very plain and basic and doesn't draw a lot of attention to showy camera moves or anything like that. It feels very realistic in that way and grounded. And I think that is something that is very unique in terms of how he looks at things. And
Yeah.
the other point you're making too on the systems thing is definitely true. And it's interesting though, because it's from a standpoint of not that systems are bad or good. It's that systems are made up of people, and those people can be bad or good inside them. And that is where his suspicion comes. Because
Mhm.
in his worldview, it seems that there are no good people, there are no bad people. Everything is just gray. So if a system is made up of people that are in neither good nor bad, sometimes systems are good and sometimes systems are bad. And it's not
Mhm.
necessarily the system itself that can corrupt, which I don't
Mhm.
personally subscribe to that worldview. I think systems can be bad and they can corrupt people and then vice versa. But Clint clearly doesn't. Like he's looking at everything through just that human element. It's a very, yeah, again, humanistic point of view that I think is just very interesting that he's challenging that all the time. Like you would think, okay, he's played cowboys and cops in movies. Well, that means he's always like the cowboy with the white hat and he's the good guy and he's fighting the bad guys, like a John Wayne situation. Or as a cop, like Arnold's usually, when he's a cop, he's like a good guy and he's killing all the bad guys. In both those situations, Clint is, as an actor, and then also when he looks at these same archetypes as a director, the cops are not usually good. They're good and
Mhm.
bad, and the criminals are
Mhm.
good and bad, and the cowboys, they're all bad in the old
Mhm.
West, basically, except for like some innocent child that he might be trying to save or something. So that I think is definitely true and unique too, in that he's able to look at everything with this completely open-hearted and empathetic standpoint, which again, initially, I think people wouldn't imagine, like you said, Clint to be just coming from those two genres as playing
Yeah.
cops and cowboys. Those are usually the most black and white genres we get.
Right.
But he's able to find the more interesting human perspective. I mean, again, I think he's a director that has some of the most empathy you find. And it's great watching these movies because it does force you as the audience member then to think, oh, actually, like maybe I should be thinking of bad guys always as bad. Or like, yeah, cops, they might be good people, but sometimes they make terrible decisions and they have
Right.
to live with those. And it's just the world is complicated. And I love that Clint recognizes that, but never judges in a way. And
Yeah.
sometimes he does, but not normally. And I think that is fascinating. I think
Yeah.
he's a truly unique artistic voice that I'm glad he's still making movies at 95 and still putting these very interesting think pieces out there. Like, I don't think he's gotten soft in his old age whatsoever.
One name you mentioned earlier, which I had not thought of until now, which is that I think, and I can't imagine or believe that I'm going to say these two names in the same sentence, but I think him and Woody Allen are actually interesting parallels. Both older guys who've been working pretty consistently, except for Woody, of course, since, all the stuff and what have
Hmm.
you. But they're both interested in humans and the choices people make. Of course, one's tone is very different from the other, but yeah, it's interesting that these two people, this is what they've been wrestling with throughout their careers, right? Of like humanity and the neurosis of humanity and the choices we make and the evils that pull us, but the gray ultimately that we all have. Because
Right.
that's true in Woody's movies too. Like nobody is good or bad, essentially. People are just
I think
gray. I mean, sometimes,
he
yeah. I mean,
he
he
likes to make
himself
himself the
puts
hero all
himself
the
in
time.
a, yeah,
But yes,
that's the
I
thing.
do. Yeah, I do agree with your
Yeah.
point. I think that also is what I realized later as I watch more of Clint's films that he is an artist as a
Yeah.
director. And again, I sort of sometimes judge, okay, an actor getting as a director, oh, they're just doing it for themselves, or they're just a journeyman director, which was honestly my initial impression of Clint when I look back over the movies. Oh,
Mhm.
there's so many different kind of genres, and sometimes he's in them. Some of them are blockbusters, some of them are smaller movies. Okay, he's just like a journeyman was something we talked about in the last episode with Ridley Scott, also a director who initially I thought was one. And then the more I dived into Clint, I realized no, he is an artist with a vision, and that's why we're talking about the fact that he does have this worldview and these themes that are in, mostly all of his pictures dating back to the early 70s when he started. What a very unique guy and one of my favorite actors of all time. And I love Clint.
Yeah.
I'm a big
Yeah, he's
Clint fan.
great.
He's
And
amazing.
I mean, this is, written about and talked about a lot. Everybody knows this, but still worth mentioning. Like, again, somebody who you have a certain kind of image in your head about, and then you find out that, oh, they're the calmest director on set. They've been working with the same group of people for years and years. There's no yelling, things are quiet, things are tight, there are no delays, then there's no excessive vanity or time spent on anything that sort of is
Hmm.
meaningless. Like all of that is important, that's how you surround yourself with great people and everybody wants to work with you, and there are not that many people, like, and again, something you would not expect of him, right? Like if you just came to his movies thinking of him as this larger than life
Hmm.
character with this persona, you'd be like, oh, this guy probably like screams and yells and like calls all the shots, but instead he just is quiet but firm, but garners respect and has worked with all kinds of people, people that you wouldn't imagine. Like one of the movies that is on your list, which I've never even heard of, just completely blew me away. I'm like, wait, you're working with these people and you're interested in this subject matter? What? This is insane to me. So all this to say, like, I think he models the kinds of movies he makes that you cannot take people on face value. You have to dig deeper because
Exactly.
he himself is like that. None of this you would expect from him, actually.
No, that's a really good point, and it just reminds me of an anecdote that maybe I should have mentioned earlier. That when I was working early in my career at a visual effects company, the company did a lot of work with Clint on the Flags of Our Fathers and Iwo Jima, and I
Mm,
saw him in the office a couple times. And
mm,
this was 20 years ago now, honestly. And he looked so old, a very old man, very quiet, like you said. You wouldn't expect this guy to be. Oh, we had directors in all the time, and you could tell. Oh, the director because they talk a lot. They try to boss people around, but like Clint was just this quiet guy, just waiting in line to get the food at lunchtime. Very big, like he's definitely he's a very tall guy, but just he looked very frail, but just very calm and like relaxing and like one of at that time I wasn't as obsessed with Clint as I am now just as an actor, but still I'm just like awestruck by like, oh my God, that's Clint Eastwood, like one of the few most
yes.
legends. I mean, he is an absolute legend. He's standing there waiting in line to get like some pasta salad or something. You would never
Yeah.
think he was Clint as an actor, but also as a director. So I think you're definitely right, that sort of calmness, which you wouldn't expect from a Dirty Harry or some of his other on-screen roles where he
No.
is more like a commanding presence. He isn't like that, and that must be why people, especially actors, love working with him because he
Yeah.
is just down to business, lets them do their thing, trusts that they're doing their thing. He's not going to get too involved and like, oh, I want to do 40 takes on this to break you down and find the real
No.
performance. He's like, no, come on set, give your real performance, and we'll move on. It's very interesting. And then when you kind of remove his on-screen persona, but then just look at his directorial work, it makes sense that this is the guy who's examining these. A
Right.
quiet examiner of the human condition is what he presents himself in person, at least to the very limited amount of time I was around him, versus his
That's
on-screen
amazing.
persona, which is so different. Which
Yeah.
I also love.
No.
Like I love
Yeah.
Dirty Harry. I love
Yeah.
the Man with No Name. He's Clint's the best.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
with that, I think we should jump to the movie of the hour.
That's right. So this is Juror number two, the latest Eastwood film, which had a limited run in theaters, and I believe probably by the time this episode comes out, should be on streaming. So if people
It's
haven't
on
seen it,
iTunes already, so people
okay.
can rent it. Yep.
Yeah, if people haven't seen it, we'll probably get into some spoilers. I know it was hard to see, so if you're planning on seeing it, maybe you want to skip ahead just to the next part of the episode where we get into his back catalog. But this is
Yeah.
juror number two. The IMDb plot summary: while serving as a juror in a high-profile murder trial, a man finds himself struggling with a serious moral dilemma, one he could use to sway the jury verdict and potentially convict or free the wrong killer. So obviously Clint Eastwood is the director here, starring Nicholas Hoult, Tony Collette, and J.K. Simmons. So I'll start with my thoughts on the film. I thought this was very good. Definitely blown away that he's still at this age able to deliver something as interesting as this movie. The plot you have to kind of go along with. So the plot is essentially that Nicholas Hoult is picked on a jury, and in this jury he realizes that the person being put on trial is for the murder of a woman he accidentally killed in a hit and run. So he realizes he's the guilty party, but there's someone else on trial for this murder. He is, has a family that he wants to protect, so he doesn't necessarily want to come forward. But what do you do in that situation? Like that's the moral dilemma. Getting back to the Clint themes, and that is a little pulpy and in a way far fetched. But because I think Clint's style is so matter of fact, grounded, and I'll use the word plain and banal, not in as pejoratives though, you kind of buy it. It doesn't feel over the top and cheesy where it feels like a soap opera, even though that is sort of like a soap opera plot. But as long as you can kind of go with that, I thought it was a great movie with a lot of really great performances, especially Nicholas Hoult just really surprised me in terms of what he was wrestling with. And a very interesting juxtaposition to Toni Collette's character in this film, too, who's a lawyer running for DA. And as she starts realizing that this case that she needs to win to help her political career, that she might be convicting an innocent man, she has to make moral choices as well about, do I put my career over someone getting free, in the same way that Nicholas Holt's character is wrestling with, do I now go to jail and basically like doom the life of my newborn child to have a father behind bars, or do I just kind of let this guy go down for this because he's kind of a bad guy, maybe he abused his girlfriend, I don't know, like
Hmm.
that's the dilemmas that he's wrestling with. I think those are fascinating. And I loved how the movie ends too with it not fully resolving or kind of making a judgment on who's being good and who's being bad here. I thought that was brilliant. So what were your initial thoughts of Juror number two?
I enjoyed it as well. I would say it's like a solid to very good movie. I wouldn't put this in kind of the great catalog of Clint. Very much felt like a HBO movie or Showtime movie or what have you. The plot itself I think is very intriguing, and though I agree it can be pulpy, but it had my attention throughout, which I think is it's so hard to pull off these days, right? Because we are just so scatterbrained,
Hmm.
and his style and his grounding of the material is critical, right? Otherwise, the tone of this could be quite weird and pulpy and cheesy, which just wouldn't work. I think he presents a lot of gravitas to a movie like this and a story like this.
Hmm.
I think the things that maybe held me back a little bit. I do like Nicholas Holt's performance, but I don't know. I find him better when he's sort of over the top, like in The Favorite or Mad Max. I
Mm.
think he's a little too flat and bland for me. And I was thinking about this that because, as you said, Clint's style is not showy. His storytelling is very grounded, but often he has really good actors who are able to sort of, I don't want to say again, elevate in like a pejorative way, but it's a great balance, right? Like the rest of the movie is grounded, but this actor really pops in
Hmm.
like the right way. And I think that balance sort of really works. And we'll see that in a lot of the movies that we'll touch today. But I think to me, he holds the movie back because he's
Mm.
just so
Interesting.
internal. Whenever Tony was on screen, I was sort of woken up. When J.K. Simmons is on screen for like a few brief screens, I was a little bit woken up. But Nicholas Hoult is the lead of the movie. And also, like physically, he looks like a San Franciscan, like a tech guy. Like we didn't do much to make him off the place, which is sort of my second kind of hellback point. Like I was saying earlier, Clint is often very interested in the towns and cities, not in like a showy way, like you said, but you feel like you live there. I don't think the scope of this movie, again, he's never showy, but you get to see the city, you get to kind of feel what it might be to live like over here. But because of partly Nicholas Holt's look, but also how the movie sort of shows Atlanta or wherever they're at. Where are they at?
Savannah. They're at Savannah.
Savannah, yeah. You sort of feel like this bar could be anywhere, where the main action happens. Or these, and I know a lot of the movies in the courtroom, so that can also be anywhere. But
Right.
usually Clint actually spends enough time or just enough time to kind of give you a sense of the place and the people, and you sort of feel transported. And I didn't. So those two things to me kind of bring it to that sort of TV movie crime drama level. Still very good and solid, but just not what I've seen Clint do in the past.
Mm. Yeah, I think I definitely liked it better than you then. I mean, I'd probably put this at the bottom end of top 10 Clint movies I've seen, which is probably
Oh,
like 25 or 26 of his movies. I think something like that I've seen. And to me, yeah, the setting. So we actually will cover a movie in our episode later that is set in Savannah that is a lot more about. I've been to Savannah, and that is that you get more of a sense of the feel of the city. Whereas
yeah,
this, to your point, yeah, it is a lot in the courtroom. But I felt the characters in this, like the scenes where there are in the courtroom, you hear the different people on the jury, and they're definitely everyday folks. There's a bus driver in there. There's like a young kid. There's a like a medical student, and that flavor to me felt like a small town. Savannah's not a big
agreed.
place. I felt like, okay, through the characters, I was transported there, though, yes, because they don't really get into the physical locations so much because it's a small movie in terms of scale. A lot of them are just
Yeah,
talking in rooms. But I felt that mix of personalities and flavors in the jury room to me felt very authentic. I mean, I've never been on a jury before, but I've gone in for jury duty and seen people try to get out of it and all the things that they talk about or
hmm,
show in this movie. And, you do kind of be like, yeah, I could see why someone in the jury could just be like, let's just get this over with. Like, let's just vote. Okay, we all think he's guilty.
yeah,
Great. Like, move forward. And these are the reasons why. Oh, I have kids, or, I just don't care. Or I have this vendetta against this type of person. All the things that come up in this to me is what made it feel real or a slice of
I
that
agree.
town.
Yeah,
But
that was
that
pretty
works.
real.
That worked for me. J.K.
Yeah,
Simmons, especially. I think those actors actually in the courtroom or on the jury in those scenes were really fun and kept the movie
I totally agree. And
moving.
often, like those scenes can feel very sort of play like,
Yes.
but they didn't. They felt movie-like as much as possible. And so yeah, I think I agree. I think there's transportation over there. But yeah, I think my issue really is, sorry to say, I do like Nicholas Hoult, but
Hmm,
it's just a little
interesting.
tad flat for me. That's my big thing.
No, that's fair. If that didn't work, that is the crux of the movie because it's his. Well, yeah, and Tony Collette too, to a certain extent, but it really is
Yeah,
his dilemma of like, what do I do, and at what point do I give up? Which he basically does, and is like, okay, I'm not going to fight this anymore. Maybe I can get away with this, and I can sort of absolve my conscience of it, and it'll be fine. There'll be
yeah.
no concern there. That I thought was interesting, and a lot of the themes too of choice were also about consequence and past choices, obviously, right? Because it was a
Hmm.
hit and run, and again, because it's Clint, you didn't. It was not like at the time he knew it was a hit and run. He thought he hit an animal, and it was
Right,
not until this jury trial that he realized, oh my gosh, actually, I was the one who killed this woman. So it wasn't. He's not a bad guy who like, oh, I hit and run. I'm gonna run away because I was drunk. They sort of play with that a little bit in the movie because he is a recovering alcoholic, but
right.
that adds these layers that I think if this were just like a kind of a John Grisham thriller or something, this would be like some bad guy who made these horrible
Yeah,
mistakes and do you forgive him or not? It's like, hey, just a normal guy who does something anyone could do, accidentally hit an animal on the side of the road and it's raining and you kind of feel for him and that's where the Clint angle of really showing empathy for this guy and you feel for him and I don't it's like what would you do in that situation? That's a lot of what this movie I think engaged me as an audience member. It's like, well, if that was me, what would I do? It's like I know the right thing to do is to turn yourself in because you don't want guilty or
right.
innocent people to go to prison. But the consequences of that are on your family and your personal life and what's more important. And at the end of the day, maybe if this guy goes away, what's the harm? Is sort of what he goes through. And I think that I like movies like this that engage you as an audience member. To your
No,
point, when we were talking about Clint earlier, he's not preachy. He's not saying
no.
this is what you need to do and make sure you do this. I don't know. He's not gonna make a call about this and just lay out what's going on and what these characters are going through, and then you put yourself immediately in those shoes. Because then you're like, oh, okay, well, that's not a bad guy, but like I'm not a perfect person either. I've everyone knows that they have good and bad in them, so it immediately puts you into his shoes, and that I thought was maybe why Nicholas Holt's performance for me, the understatedness sort of helped a little bit. I'm not a huge fan of his, to be honest, as an actor, and I don't like I dislike him, but
Yeah,
I'm
he's
not
fine.
gonna like run out and see him. But I thought in this actually he did a very good job. I want to call it his performance for me at least. It really did work with the struggle
Yeah,
that
I
he was
think the
going through.
internal dilemma of what you're talking about, like that definitely comes through. And I have to give him credit for that because if that didn't come through and this internal struggle, everything falls apart. And no, the movie is very good. And so I should give him due credit for that part. It's
Hmm.
just that I think he, again, I'm projecting majorly, but it sort of feels like he might have been like, oh, another director through editing and sound cues and such would sort of heighten some of this
Uh,
stuff
hmm,
versus Clint doesn't do any of that, right?
right.
Like it's very much about what you're doing. So that's where like there's a little bit of sort of blandness that comes through, and just sort of his look in general. Like I wish they just
Hmm,
played a little bit more attention to sort of where are we and who is this person, and it sort of kept me a little bit at arm's length. But yeah, the internal struggle that he's going through, like that is evident from the very first scene when he's cleaning the dishes and talking about kind of the preparation of this like baby shower and what have you. You can feel something is off here. Why
hmm.
is this so important? And the way he tends to his wife, like, so there's trauma there, of course, because the first child, again, huge, all of this is spoiler. So,
Yeah.
the first baby that they had sort of didn't make it. So they're
Hmm.
carrying this sort of trauma, so there's a lot there. But you're so right. Like, this is classic Clinton. I love those stories. I thought about this movie for days after, not just for the specific incident of this movie, but just in general, right? Because that's what happens with good movies. At first, you're thinking about what would I do if I were in those shoes,
Hmm.
but then it becomes bigger, where you start to think about yourself or other people in your life who've done maybe questionable things, but they are good people.
Right.
How do you reckon with that? How do you reckon with yourself? And I think we're all carrying these things, right? I mean, I have not run over anybody in my life, but I've probably, poked
Neither have
that.
I. I just want to put that on so we have this recorded too. My silence is not. Yes, I'm not either.
So yeah, I'm very glad this movie exists and was made, and great to see Clint at this age, being able to put something like this together, which is entertaining, thought provoking, well mounted, pretty amazing how many people can do that.
Exactly. Yeah, I remember when this was announced, I think last year or something. I was like, "Oh, he's making another movie? Like that's crazy at his age." And then they made it so quickly because he always is able
Yeah,
to put pictures together so fast, and then just have it come out and be this good is just a testament to his skills as a filmmaker. And I hope people who haven't seen this movie yet, definitely, I think this is one of those movies where everyone should enjoy some aspect of it.
yeah,
So if it's, especially if it's on some streaming platform, I think it's coming to Max at some point around the
yeah.
holidays. I definitely would check this out and
Yeah, I
high
recommend it for
review.
sure. And especially
Hmm.
at home, this would play even better, I think.
Hmm.
So great
Absolutely.
family viewing during the holidays. Like everybody's gonna like this movie, I think. So yeah.
Yeah. And good discussion afterwards. You watch this in a
Yeah.
group. I think then it's a lot of debate because the movie ends with not really knowing what the consequences are going to be with Tony Collette or with Nicholas Holt's character, which I
Great
liked
ending
actually. They
scene.
so well done. Though I suspect that she made the right choice. She's going to turn him in, is what I think is going to happen. But I like that they don't say that. It's
I do
great.
too. I guess one thing we should mention is that another journey that Toni Collette's character goes through, like she in the beginning is very much like systems work and law works the way it is. And it's sort of fun to see that journey unfold as well, where she starts to question some of that, that, oh, have we made the wrong decision here? And goes on
Hmm.
her own. And so, yeah, we didn't mention too much about that journey, but that also is very classic Clint, right? And I almost wish she had like a little bit more time spent on her, or the movie
Hmm.
had a little bit more time spent on her, because that's a pretty fascinating journey as well, where she's standing up for, high profile position and really believes in doing right and such. And then all of her kind of belief systems are being questioned as she goes through this. And we don't really get to learn much about her, which maybe you could argue having just one focal point in a movie is good, but I think this movie had a little bit more room to play maybe her life a little bit more up as well and juxtapose how these two people in very different circumstances are kind of having this kind of moral belief crisis of
Yeah.
sorts, right? Like, who are we? Where do we stand? And then it would have, I think, mounted the pressure towards that ending scene even more if you would have spent a little bit more time with Toni Collette, who obviously is a brilliant actress. So I love watching her in anything and everything.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just another classic Clint theme, like you mentioned at the beginning of the episode too, is this questioning of systems
Yep.
and showing that it's not that the justice system is good or bad. The justice system is made up of people, especially in this example, on a jury. And none of those
Right.
jury members were bad people, even though they were
No.
going to make a bad decision to railroad this guy. And they all have their reasons, and you understand each of those reasons to like, oh, let's just convict him, and this is easy, open shut case. So I think that is again where Clint's worldview is. There is like people are not good or bad at the outset, and that's why you can't necessarily believe in the systems. They're just the only ones we have, and can't pass judgment on them. Which again,
No.
it's not my worldview is everyone is good at the outset, and good people can make bad decisions, and that is sort of that's where I start from. But he starts from in the middle, and that's fine, and it makes for interesting examination of things. Okay, so now we're moving on to other films that Clint directed. These are gonna something we do in every episode. So these are gonna be our top threes. So first, we're gonna talk about our first love of Clint as a director. So this is the movie that first made an impact on us that he directed. Then we're gonna get to Clint's masterpiece. This is the movie that we think resonates with us the most personally, and is the best movie that Clint has put out as a director. And then finally, the wild card. This is another movie that's important to us in some other way. Maybe it's a big swing that Clint made that didn't work. Maybe it was something out of the box that he normally doesn't do. Maybe it was a box office flop and no one talks about it, but we think of a hidden gem that deserves a little more recognition. So we're going to go into our top threes. And actually, I will kick this off and go into my
Mhm.
first love of Clint as a director, which is the 1997 film Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Again, directed by Clint, starring John Cusack, Kevin Spacey. The IMDb plot summary: a visiting city reporter's assignment suddenly revolves around the murder trial of a local millionaire whom he befriends. This was the first movie of Clint that I saw, actually, whether actor or director. Actually, I saw this on VHS, rented it when it first came out back in '97 because it was based on a book that was a giant phenomenon here in the States. And I read
Yeah.
this book when I was in high school. one of the few early memories of mine of being like a page turner where it's like, oh my God, I gotta
Mm.
find out what happens. And it sucked me in and I love this book. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna rent this movie. And I was a kid and didn't know that this had come out and was a huge critical and box office flop and is not a film that is looked back, I think even now, fondly on in terms of Clint's output. And this also was a movie when I came into this. Again, I had never seen a Clint movie. So I assumed that as a director, again, I was surprised he even made this. Like, oh, wait, Clint Eastwood, isn't he that guy who's in those Dirty Harry movies? Like, that was sort of my outset. And my impression after watching this too was, okay, maybe this is just like, again, a journeyman director. He's not in the movie. I don't really understand why a guy who's a cowboy, and a Dirty Harry guy would make a movie like this. So I kind of wrote him off actually a bit as a director when I first saw this too. However, I really enjoyed the movie when I first saw it. I felt that it captured the book and the uniqueness of the book in a way that was really interesting. I thought the atmosphere of really feeling like the quirkiness and the weirdness of Savannah, which is a place I have been, and it has a very specific quirky vibe to it, comes across really well. I think the performances are great. I'm a huge John Cusack fan, so that really worked for me a lot. And Kevin Spacey, you know, all the stuff that's happened to him. Obviously, he's not a good guy at all. But I think he's a great actor, and this is a performance that I, for me, works really well. And yeah, I'll get into more of my thoughts, which are basically though, like as the years have gone on, the couple times I come back to this, has sort of dropped in my mind, honestly, in terms of how it works for me as a film. But curious if you'd seen this before, and then we can get into more of the movie. Yeah, what are your thoughts on the Midnight of Garden of Good? Had you entered the garden before?
Yeah. I had never even heard of this movie. So when you put on this list, I'm like, is this a real movie or what is this? And I was blown away by the movie. I wouldn't say like it's a masterpiece or anything, but just
Hmm.
the fact that Clint made this movie, I think I'm still kind of marveling in that surprise of
Uh-huh.
like Clint chose this subject matter and made this movie. But then to go deeper, yeah, I think it captures the place. I've never been to Savannah, but you really get a tactile, textural sense of the people and the place and the quirkiness of it and kind of old money, new money, the people, on the sidelines and where they at and how the social circles kind of evolve, like all of that. I'm sure it's in the book, but it's captured beautifully in the movie. Super entertaining. The performances are great. Some might even say this is Kevin Spacey typecasting or put, I was like, oh, of course you're playing this role.
Well, at the time we didn't know, but
At the
yes,
time we
now,
didn't
yeah.
know, but I was like, oh wow, this was like this role is made for you. All things aside, he is a very good actor,
He
but
is. He is. He is.
so uh, I'm not a big John Cusack fan, as we've discussed. And first,
Hmm.
I was like, oh gosh, I'll have to watch this mouth area
Oh
the
yeah,
whole
your mouth
time.
area thing. Yeah.
Yes, because there's a lot of weirdness there as well, and just like button eyes. And I was like, oh, but
Yeah.
then actually he's great in the movie because he's a great kind of audience surrogate kind of character, kind of bland but interesting enough, and you kind
Yep.
of go along the journey with him. So, but I think the thing that particularly interested me in the movie, and your mileage might vary. People might be like, oh, why are you handling, especially from like 2024 lens, right? People might be like, oh, why are you handling subject matters like homosexuality and drag and people who are wielding power and using their sexuality in different ways? And but I don't know, I found all of that done pretty interestingly. And again, in classic Clint fashion, even though he's so early in his directing career, there's no judgment. Like there's a drag queen character in the movie. Yeah, there are other people in the town who might be passing judgment towards her, but not Clint and not the movie. I thought that actor did a great job and had so much to do in the movie.
She's not an actor, by the way.
Oh, she's a real drag queen, I think.
Well, no, like this is based on a true story, and that's actually her. She's playing herself in the movie. Yeah,
Wow.
which I think to me, like in terms of the looking at the 2024 lens, I think that I was worried going back to this because I hadn't seen it in a while. It's like, okay, well, how are they going to deal with like trans issues back in the 90s? And I think it's hard to again judge her performance because it's her. Like you can't say, "Oh,
Yeah,
you're sexualizing." Well, that's who she was and she's playing
yeah.
herself. Again, you can't sort of paint an entire community either with a broad brush. They're going to be,
All kinds of
trans folks that
people.
like overly playing off the sexuality that she has, and I think that's cool. And I think that was a standout character, at least to me, when I saw the movie
Oh,
the
great.
first
I had
time,
no
because she's
idea.
the real person. That's
I had
actually
no
her.
idea. I mean,
Yeah.
it looked like this person performs, and she probably does if she's playing their character in the movie. I thought she was great,
Hmm.
and also how Kevin Spacey's kind of he's gay and how that is handled in the movie and how that's revealed. All
Yep.
of that feels pretty nuanced, but also entertaining. And Clint has this unique gift of sort of not painting, life like you said with a broad paintbrush. Like it was just it, and you do that when you create all these structural elements that make it specific, right? That this is specific about this place, this
Correct.
time, these people. This
Hmm.
is not some sweeping statement. And then ultimately, are these people able to get to the truth of the people that they are playing? And they do. So I don't know. I was thoroughly entertained. I will say, and I'm now very curious to read the book. Like some of the plot things just maybe were dropped in the movie, or I didn't quite land on me, which is like,
Hmm.
why did Kevin Spacey seek out John Cusack to come here? And was there some sort of a relationship even between the two of them? So that's one question mark. Second question mark, it's great to see like John Cusack's character has no judgment or anything on the drag queen character at
Yeah.
all, right?
Yeah.
Like they're pals. And that's just so matter of fact and wonderful to kind of see in the movie. Like his sexuality is a bit of a question mark in the movie to me. And
He
I
gets off with
wonder,
Clint Eastwood's daughter in the movie. Come on.
that's fine.
Okay.
Who,
She does an okay job, and she sings the last, like the song over the closing
right.
credits. But yeah, she doesn't like light up the screen as much as the rest of the actors.
No.
But
But there's some
the
unanswered questions in my mind. So,
yes, so John Cusack is playing the author of the book. So it's sort of an autobiography of him going down and then just going down to cover just a ball at Kevin Spacey's
right,
house. And then it turns out there's a murder, and then he ends up actually moving to Savannah later, writing some articles, then writes this book, which becomes a giant bestseller, and then this
right,
film comes out. So I don't know. Yeah, that's interesting. I think the point though about that you made about individual people and not painting communities or things with a broad brush, I think is Clint too. Like he looks at every person as an individual, not
yeah,
bringing any preconceived notions of, oh, well, you're a drag queen, so you must act like this, or you're this type of person, or you're a closeted gay,
right,
socialite, so you must have these. I was like, no, like everyone, he looks at every single person as an individual, which I think is a good way to
right.
go through life, honestly, because people
Totally.
can, yeah, and I like that, and I think you do see that in this film, and I think that it is also interesting that in a way that's kind of like what some of this people in this community think too. Like, yes, Kevin Spacey in this is the real life guy too was closeted, but everyone knew he was gay,
Right,
and they still let him into all of their social circles, even though they might have been against his lifestyle. They didn't let that stop them from inviting him in. And yeah, you could argue that's two-faced and hiding
but
truths and things like that, but that's just the society
that's
that
reality.
Savannah had, especially in the South. There's a lot of that. Like, look the other way, even though you might hate on someone, there's all this pretend and all this kind of
Right,
stuff. The Southern hospitality, right? There's two
right.
sides to that. I think Clint captures that really well in this movie as John Cusack, and again, like you said, an audience surrogate character goes in, and you're sort of like, what's going on? Like, how is this even functioning? How are you, like, obviously this guy's gay. Like, why are you letting him do this? But then you start to realize as more layers of the town and the society kind of get pulled back, it all just sort of makes sense. And same thing with Lady
Yeah.
Chablis, like coming into that one scene where she's disrupting that nice dinner for some association in some society. It's
Oh,
like
yeah.
they let her come in, and they're polite to her. They don't immediately kick her out, even though she is basically hitting on one of the sons at that
Yeah. And
dinner
causing a huge
and
ruckus.
causing a huge
And
ruckus. They don't be like, oh, get out of here. We don't want any, drag queens around here. It's like, no, everyone just sort of lets her be. And I think that's interesting. And maybe that might be what attracted Clint to this story, because those contradictions and the interesting morality that every individual has in this community, which was captured in the book too.
yeah,
But maybe
right.
that's what attracted him to this too. Because at the outset, I remember even at the time when I saw his name on the closing credits, when I first saw this, it was like Clint Eastwood, like the cowboy guy, like he's the director. I didn't completely devoid of the Clint persona on screen. But to your point you were making earlier, I think it captures him as a person in terms of what he looks at and how he looks at the world.
Totally. No, I really enjoyed this. I'm so glad you put this on the list, and I want to read the book for sure,
Yeah, and you should go to Savannah too. It's a beautiful place that
which I want to
is
do as well.
so
That's been
well
on my list
captured
for a long time.
in
Yeah.
this movie. Super unique, and I highly
Yeah.
recommend. I'm not getting paid by the tourism board. I will just note this is not a hashtag ad, but I think people need to go and check out that city. It's very special. What is your first love of Clint Eastwood as a director? What do you have for us?
Okay, so my first love is a movie called Hereafter from 2010, directed by Clint Eastwood, of course, starring Matt Damon, Cecile de France, Bryce Dallas Howard, and a bunch of other folks. An American factory worker, a French journalist, and a London schoolboy set out on a spiritual journey after death touches their lives in different ways. It's sort of an odd thing as to this is the first movie of his that I stumbled upon, even though I knew a Million Dollar Baby and what have you. But this is the time in my
Hmm.
life, and I just moved to LA and, 2009, 2010. And I don't think I watched it in the theater. I probably just rented it from Blockbuster or something, just seeing Matt Damon on the cover. No clue. And so, if you haven't seen the movie, this is a pretty depressing, sad movie. And I think a lot of the reason why it captured me at the time, even though it's sentimental, maybe overly sentimental, because I think I was in that phase of my life, like new in LA, sort of lonely. And, there's something about that kind of captured me. But I watched this movie since, and I don't know. It's first of all, once again, very interesting to me that Clint Eastwood is delving into the afterlife. It's not something that I would think of. That why would he be interested in that? I'm as a person not really interested in that of like what happens to us when we die. This is not a question I think about, but I think once again he comes at this material with a lot of sincerity and a lot of empathy and a lot of heart. This subject matter can be very pulpy, or overly sentimentalized or overly lame. And there are parts of this that maybe are that, but for the most part, it feels very sincere. And a lot of that has to do with Clint, and a lot of that has to do with the performances that he gets from all of his actors. Like it feels not sensationalized at all. But I think the more I watch this movie, yes, it is about the question of what happens after life, after death. But to me, it's more about dealing with loss. And once again, there's an empathy quality to all these people. And that's the part that touches me the most. That when you're sitting across somebody on a bus ride or looking at somebody in the line to get coffee, you have no idea what their story is, what they've gone through in their life, who they've lost, who they are thinking about. And there's something very human about that, I think. And once again, it's overly sentimental, or it can be, but I guess I am drawn to that often. So I don't know. There's something very touching and moving about that all these people and how they all then come together. You could argue that, yeah, it's a bit of a screenwriting miracle that all these three stories come together. But I don't know. I buy it just given the tonality of the movie and how earnest the performances are. And once again, the movie has scale. Like you are literally in three different places, actually four, because the movie starts with a tsunami. And it's also very timely of events that were happening at that time of tsunami, the tube bombing,
Yeah.
all of this stuff is kind of captured in the movie without without making it heavy-handed. It sort of feels very matter of fact, just the way Clint is, right? Like, oh, these things are happening, but it's all from the angle of these humans and the struggles that they are having. So I'm curious if you'd watched this movie before.
Yeah, so I'd seen this when it came out. This was post like Million Dollar Baby, Gran Torino, and all
Right.
of a sudden now it's like, okay, well, I love Clint as a actor and I love Clint as a director, so I'm going to see everything that he made. I might even seen this like opening weekend, and I remember being disappointed just coming off of some of his
Right.
greatest works of the decade. Not disliking the movie, I'm just like, okay, like wasn't maybe what I thought it was or hoping it was in terms of quality. And I hadn't actually seen it since then until this rewatch, and I still sort of feel the same way. It doesn't fully work for me, especially the third act. It gets me a little lost,
Yeah.
but I think you're definitely right in that it's interesting that he's tackling supernatural elements. Like Matt Damon is a psychic who can
Yeah.
see and talk to people who have died. And the movie doesn't treat it as like sensationalized and treats it as very matter of fact. And like you kind of believe, okay, well, now in this universe, I guess there are people that can talk to the dead. And with your point about empathy, and I think this movie is definitely just about grief and sadness,
Oh
right? And how
yeah.
you deal with loss. And the interesting thing about this film is that it shows how loss affects people in different ways. And there isn't a okay, well, if someone passed away, this is how people react, and this is then how you react to them, and there's some rule that you can have when dealing with people who've gone through something because everyone is different. Everyone deals with grief and
Mhm.
loss in a completely different way. Some people
Mhm.
shut down, like the the boy whose brother got killed, which is like the saddest part of that whole
The
movie, is
saddest
his
thing. Oh my
storyline is so
gosh.
sad. Or the woman who experiences the tsunami and survives, just how that affects her work life and changing sort of where her career is going. So there's a lot
Mhm.
people and Matt Damon's character having so much trouble just in relationships because of what he's gone through. So I think that is the message of the movie. Really, to me, it's like you have to have grace for people that have been through something, because even if you've been through something, if you've been through have a horrible loss, they're going to deal with the loss in a different way, because everyone again is an individual and has their own individual life experiences. And that message of the movie I do really like, and that he's also not passing judgment on people trying to get hope through different ways, whether it's like religion or different seminars or even like the psychic stuff. Like you kind of get why people go after those
Yeah.
things to try to find answers, because their whole world has changed with unexpected or even expected loss
Yeah.
can shake someone up like that. So I think the themes in this movie are great and the performances are phenomenal. I think Matt Damon is just
He's just so
excellent,
good.
excellent in this movie. And
Totally is lost in this everyday person
oh yeah,
who's sweet but traumatized, but
uh-huh.
has this amazing gift and amazing.
The scenes with Bryce Dallas Howard where he meets her, and it's like, okay, there could be a little romance here, but then you realize like he's dealing with too much.
Can't.
He can't let her in, and then it goes nowhere. And I like that it's not something where she saves him in some way. Yes, he sort of has a relationship with the French woman at the end, which again, I'm sort of like the third act of this movie is a little too
Yeah, that was
convenient
a
and sort
little
of
too neatly tied in a bow.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
But I think overall the movie's fine. Like it's I don't think it's one of his best. I think it's interesting that he tackled something very outside of the box, even though his themes are right there. And I also want to call out, you mentioned set pieces in the intro when we talked about
Oh,
him. The tsunami set piece in the beginning of this movie
it's
is
amazing.
so well done,
It still
harrowing.
holds up.
Absolutely. The effects are incredible, but also just the way that he doesn't sensationalize something that's just
No,
horrible at the outset. It's not some overly dramatic and wrought. I mean, again, Titanic is my favorite movie of all time, maybe, but that
right.
that deals with the drownings and it's very big and
Theatrical and
theatrical. It's James Cameron, love it. But
right.
Clint's take on this is just so it's almost like sadder because it feels absolutely real. Like just the water comes, people get swept up, they're getting hit, they're drowning, they're getting knocked with these different things, stuff. It just like an incredible sequence. That alone, I think, is one of the best things he's able to put on screen. And I
Yeah,
wouldn't expect major set pieces, action set pieces like that to be in an Eastwood film. Like normally it's like a car chase or a
right.
shootout, and all these different things that he's done in other movies is very unique for him. And I think he handles it just incredibly well.
Totally.
That scene is harrowing.
Totally. And to your point, like in service of the story, right? Because sometimes, like the movie Impossible
Exactly.
about the tsunami, it's
Hmm.
not like glorifying, but it's sort of letting you sit and rot in the destruction and devastation of this. But this is very much in service of what's happening to these people and specifically that woman, what
Hmm.
she goes through. So it's not sensationalizing the devastation either. Like it's epic, but it's also very grounded. Like it's such a fine balance because if that opening sequence was overly done, either the Titanic scale or the Impossible scale, it'll change the tone of the movie entirely.
Right.
It's just so critical to get the tone of that set piece right. Because ultimately, you have to believe that this is now a changed woman,
Right.
as it would be, right? Like with
Absolutely.
each of those three stories, I could just watch a movie about those three stories, or like a mini series of some sort. Although
Hmm.
it would be very depressing mini series, nobody would watch it except me. But
Yeah. Yeah.
but I believe that, right? Like you don't have to go through a tsunami. Like what if you go through an accident or something, and you're back to work? What would it feel like?
Right.
You'd be
Right.
like, why am I here? And maybe the things you're after, but then you also want to hold on to what you had before. Like I love all those glances of the little advertisement that she looks at where her face is at in the beginning, but then it sort of
Yes.
gets replaced,
Hmm.
it just like subtle touches like that. Like, yeah, I don't even want that, but I still kind of want that because that's who I was, but I'm no longer that. And then how do you find the new you? It's great. Like on one hand, her story is a story of like redefinition and she gets there.
Hmm.
Matt Damon's story is of sort of kind of rejection of who he is, but then also it's sort of him getting more comfortable with just living with who he is,
Right. Accepting it
right?
in a way,
Accepting
right?
it
He
in a
has a
way,
power to be a psychic, and that's just what he has to live with. And
right? You
which means
can't be running away from that.
right. He's surrounded by everyone else's grief and death his entire life because of that. And that
Yeah,
is now what he, as like like sort of like a grief counselor or something, or
yeah.
that is just what he's dealing with.
Yeah, and then the boy, that like that dialogue that happens with him and his twin brother who's died is about like, I'm with you and I'm in
Yeah.
you all the time. Like again, Clint fashion, it's not overplayed, it's
Right.
just like one simple sentence. That's all you need to understand that, okay, you have to. So I love how the three stories are ultimately about redefinition. But yeah, the third act feels a little bit rushed up and maybe too neatly tied up, where the boy is calling him and saying that, oh, I know where the girl is staying at this hotel. I'm like, that didn't need to happen in this movie.
Right, like the Love Actually ending of like all the stories come
No.
together in a neat way at the end. It's like that I started kind of losing believability and it became less interesting. And the movie is incredibly sad and it's also that I think colors my enjoyment and view of this movie just because it is I mean, it's sad issues like grief and death are really sad. It's
Yeah.
like, do I want to sit in that for 2 hours? Even if it's handled well, like I don't know. But it is a very interesting entry into his filmography and interesting this is the first one that you had seen it that he directed.
Yeah.
So moving on from First Loves, it's time to get to masterpieces. So what is our masterpiece of Clint Eastwood? So masterpiece that I have is this also your masterpiece. And
Yep.
it's a movie we've covered on the podcast before. It is Unforgiven, a movie I'm sure people have heard of from 1992. The plot summary: retired Old West gunslinger Will Money reluctantly takes on one last job to avenge an injustice with the help of his old partner and a newer outlaw known simply as the Schofield Kid. So, directed by Eastwood, starring Eastwood,
Hmm.
also Gene Hackman and Morgan Freeman. I talked about this movie. I brought it into the episode of Movies That Shaped Our Feelings of Movies, part two. So if people want to go back and hear my thoughts on how this movie helped me understand and appreciate Westerns more and just from a genre perspective, that's a great discussion I think we had back in that episode. But for me, the reason why I brought this in as my masterpiece for Clint is I really think that it is the cleanest distillation of this worldview that we've been talking about of there are no good people or bad people and that the choices that people make they have consequences and they stay with you and what do you think when you think back on your life about the choice that you made how those choices also sets your reputation. I think these are just the distillation of all of these things he touches on in every movie. They're laid the barest here and just handled so incredibly masterfully. And I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that he is in the movie. So he brings the weight of his own on-screen persona and all the things that he's done as Dirty Harry and
Hmm.
the Man with No Name and all these Westerns and things like that, where he never played a guy with the white hat. He was always doing kind of questionable things. That I think to me adds a lot more weight because you bring that baggage into this movie, even though you don't need it to have the story hit you. But I think it helps a lot in this, and a lot more things to say about the film. But yeah, want to start with your thoughts on this. I think the first time you'd seen this was when I brought it into the episode last,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
It probably was the first Western I saw kind of from beginning to end and kind of blew me away and got me interested in watching Westerns because I just was like, oh, I just had a very stereotypical idea of like black and white or maybe too slow. And this is a deep, deep movie from beginning to end. And of course, like you said, it's like a perfect distillation of all the themes that he's dealt with and has been dealing with. But his presence also, it's a bit of a character study and rumination reflection on his own screen persona, which to your point kind of just brings extra weight to it, because he's
Hmm.
playing with audience expectation as well, that okay, that guy who you've been seeing gunslinging and making questionable choices all these years, if you met him at this point in his life, what is the weight of that, what is the cost of that? And that just gives like so much more heft to the movie. But then also I think we've talked about some great performances in Clint Eastwood movies, but this might be at the very top of the totem pole in terms of Gene Hackman's performance in this
Hmm.
movie.
Yeah.
And just seeing the two of them together go toe to toe, like that has its own level, and that sort of elevates the movie even further. And then technically, like this movie is from the opening stills of the sun going down
Oh
and
yeah.
what have you. It's just so magical and beautiful. It's a sweeping western with all this depth, meaning, weight on it, and that's why it's a masterpiece.
Absolutely, yeah. That opening too, I love the
Yeah,
film is bookended by these shots
right,
of his wife has died, so he's a gunslinger who killed a bunch of people, basically a bad guy. He was a bad guy who then found love, married, settled down, had kids, and his wife died of an illness. And the movie starts and ends with the wife's grave. And I love the text that appears over the opening and the closing of the movie talking about the wife's mother really not understanding why she ever was with this guy or fell for him because he's a bad guy. And I think what that is really saying is about reputation, that
right.
people, if you've done bad actions and you have a reputation that might be bad, people assume you're a bad person, and then there's nothing about you that is redeemable. And why would she ever fall in love with this person who's clearly terrible? And she never understands. At the end of the movie, again, hear from the mother of passed away wife saying, he disappeared, and she still will never understand why she was ever with him. And that again is showing that even though you make bad decisions, you have a bad reputation, but that doesn't mean you're a bad person. Because
Yeah,
he wrestles with things in this movie. He has regret. He's like, yeah, I killed a ton of people, but do I feel good about it? No, I don't think I
no,
do. I love that layer onto this movie, that reputation piece, which also you can say could be Clint as well.
right.
Like as an actor, it's like, well, you played all these horrible people in these movies. Like, is that who you are? Are you going to be like a Dirty Harry on set and telling me to make my day every time? Like that. I think that layer into this is interesting too, to your point of like him as an actor and that persona, I think layers on some really fascinating things in this movie.
Totally. And just a commentary on masculinity. Maybe at some place, Clint Eastwood thinks about this that, okay, all the Dirty Harry movies have maybe made young men think about masculinity in a certain kind of way. And as I get older, maybe I need to speak to them in a certain way and say that, oh, well, yeah, that's probably one side of it, but there's more to it. You have to look at this in a more sort of wholesome, rounded kind of way.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
and he's doing that while looking at himself and the characters he's played. So it's just so layered.
Exactly. There's actually, so since we've been doing this episode, I've kind of gone off and continued to watch a bunch of Clint directed movies I've never seen. So I'm in the middle of doing that. Maybe I'll finish all of his 30 whatever. But there's a movie that I just saw that he made a little before this called White Hunter Black Heart that also deals with this exact same theme, but through the lens of Hollywood about image on screen versus off screen and how that affects the person. There's just something I just want to mention because you were mentioning
Mm,
that movie deals with a lot of those themes. It's not the
mm,
greatest film, but I think it was very interesting. His first kind of exploration of touching that, but more specifically about Hollywood. So I recommend to listeners check that out if you
mm.
haven't heard it. It's not really well known. Again, I don't think it's that great, but it still hits on this theme, which this movie does so well. But I do, again, Gene Hackman's performance and his character too. Like he's a guy who's just trying to build a house, he's trying to retire. You don't really think of him as a bad guy. He's just trying to keep the crime out of his town after these prostitutes get cut up and they trying to come into this town and kill the people that hurt us. Well, he doesn't want all these outlaws coming into his town, roughing things up and causing problems. So you understand where he's coming from too, even though he does terrible things in the film,
Right.
especially to Morgan Freeman's character. And he's not a good guy, but you
No.
like empathize with where he's coming from, which again I think is a very key component to Clint's worldview of like even a bad guy like Gene Hackman's bad sheriff in this. Like I get it. Like I get what he's doing. I mean, I wouldn't do the same myself. And I guess I can also judge his actions, but it comes from a place where of understanding, which is all what empathy is about. It doesn't mean you condone
Right.
everything people are doing, right? I think his performance is might be his best Gene Hackman
Yeah,
performance in any film, though he's a fantastic actor and I
it
love
really
Hackman,
is.
but this
So
is
glad he
so good.
won for this. I think he did.
He did, yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one to follow, but I think we have some good jewels coming up. So with
There we
that,
go.
do you want to share your wild card?
Sure. So my wild card is Richard Jewell. This is a movie that Clint made in 2019. The IMDb plot summary: security guard Richard Jewell is an instant hero after foiling a bomb attack at the 1996 Olympic Games, but his life becomes a nightmare when the FBI leaks to the media that he is a suspect in the case. Directed by Clint Eastwood, starring Paul Walter Hauser, Sam Rockwell, John Hamm, and Kathy Bates. I'll explain why this movie is my wild card, and then we can get more into discussion of the film. And curious to hear your thoughts on it too. But like for me, first of all, I think this is easily one of his best movies he's ever done, and a movie that I do think needs a lot more recognition and discussion. I do think this will stand the test of time. Again, I think it's one of his top five films. Just incredible movie. But the other reason why I think this, for me, is a wild card is very similar to a lot of things we were talking about in Unforgiven. He's questioned his own archetypes, right, of these characters that he's played. And what this movie, I think, is doing is turning it back onto the audience in a way. So Richard Jewell, who's a security guard at the Olympic bombing, this is a true story that happened. I remember when the bomb went off at the
Mhm.
Olympic Games in Atlanta in '96. This guy's a security guard, but he loves law enforcement. Probably because maybe he watched a bunch of Clint Eastwood movies too. Clint Eastwood, in a way, glorifies law enforcement in a sense in his films, and yet that system is turned against him where the people, his heroes, are out to get him. And what does that look like? What is someone who's been raised to venerate the law? Again, maybe because I've watched a lot of Clint films. How, when the law comes after you, do you realize the law is actually not as great as you think? Do you still want to be in law enforcement? Like wrestling with that moral quandary, I think is really interesting. And the fact that he's turning that back on his own fans in a way, people that love the movies that he made, which again I think are a lot of venerating law. What happens and how do you handle that? So that is why I think it's very interesting that he's able to bring this back to the audience in a very specific way, or at least that's one of the layers that I read into this film. In a way, this could be a masterpiece for him too. He's made a couple that I think are like close to 10-star movies, and this is one of them. But what are your thoughts on Richard Jewell? And then I'll get to more of my thoughts of the film itself.
I didn't know about the true story when I watched the movie and was completely blown away by it. But I agree, I think it requires a lot more examination. And I think that's pretty brilliant. I didn't think about it that way, that, yeah, Richard Jewell probably grew up watching Clint Eastwood movies and is
Yeah,
enamored by
right.
it. But what comes through, and this is where I think we've not mentioned this so far, is that Clint Eastwood, by and large, is a great casting person as well. Because
Hmm.
guess what? So much of the movies kind of depends on who you have in the movie. And I think this is just like perfect casting. It's a great, I think, surrogate for what Clint has been doing his whole life, like examining real people with true empathy. And here too, like you could argue and say, oh, maybe this guy's like a simpleton or what have you, but there's no judgment from the movie or Clint's point of view. It's very matter of fact. And it's sort of just in front of you. You can make your own judgment just the way the world is as well. So it's
Hmm.
a pretty meta movie of like, oh, are you just like the sad sack person who did this to draw attention to yourself? Or are you just maybe not that bright? Or are you just so earnest that you just didn't see this coming, or somewhere in the middle of all of those things, you know? And it's a great way to pull the audience in, but it's also a great way to explore this character. Because guess what? I think we all have a little bit of Richard Jewell in us, you
Hmm.
know? But then juxtaposing that with media circus and the law enforcement circus, like that is when the movie kind of really takes into high gear. I still can't imagine and believe that this actually happened. It's crazy how the story unfolds. And once again, systems are at question here. And I will say this is the one place where normally, like we've been saying, that even people who are in systems that are maybe not great, they're making poor choices or bad or even good choices. Here, the villains a little bit are cartoony, like Olivia Wilde and John Hammond, all these people, cackling away and what have you. I'm sure there are people like that in media or law enforcement that have done those things, probably, but it's just stands out a little bit in a Clint Eastwood movie because normally the villains are a little bit more layered and textured. So there's not so much of that here.
Yeah,
But maybe it's in service of the story. Maybe this is what happened. I don't know.
yeah, it's really like another layer that sometimes I think about this movie and is similar to that in that essentially, John Hamm's character, who's an FBI agent, who is going to the situation trying to find who the bomber is. Okay, there's some things that maybe point to Richard Jewell being the one instead of it being the hero, he was actually the bomber. And then he starts essentially trying to do whatever he can, push the law to the limits to try to get a confession or something out of him so he can win his case. And that's essentially Dirty Harry. I mean, Dirty Harry goes outside of the law, like he bends the law because he's trying to find the criminal, and it doesn't really matter. And as an audience member, you're cheering that. It's like, yeah, Dirty
Yeah,
Harry. Like I know you're supposed to read him as Miranda rights, but yeah, rough him up a little bit first. Like he's a bad guy,
right.
right? And that's happening to Richard Jewell. Basically, Dirty Harry's on him. And now you're looking at Dirty Harry being like, what are you doing? Like, you're a bad
Right.
guy. You are, to your point, over the top and trying to railroad this person. And I just wonder again if that's Clint just wrestling with the types of movies he's made before in the past and people that might have cheered Dirty Harry pushing the law enforcement to the limit to get the bad guy is now they're condemning John Hamm's character doing the exact same thing to Richard Jewell. Like he's a bad guy in this, and if it was 1971 and he was playing Dirty Harry, people would be cheering in the audience to try to
Right.
get the guy who did it. I just think that is a fascinating layer as well, and really does play also with the Richard Jewell character. I think is so fascinating is throughout the entire movie, like I said, he's saying yes, sir, to all the law enforcement. He has so much respect and
Right.
veneration for the law. Like that is defines him as a person that keep coming back to this scene in his house. He has a portrait of himself when for a while he was a cop, proud, police officer and his officer photo. There's always just hanging there in the background, just reminding you how much this guy loves law enforcement. He thinks of himself as that. And John Hamm's FBI are just using that almost against him.
Mm-hmm.
The lawyer played by Sam Rockwell is incredible in this. And he's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
Richard, they're
Very good.
coming to your house. They're taking your stuff. Do not say anything. And
Right.
immediately come in, it's like, oh, I'll help you guys out. Like I'm law too. Like anything you need. And Sam Rockwell's like, what are you doing? And it's not because he's a simpleton or an idiot or like doesn't know what's going on. He just he respects the law is like the defining thing about him. And when that's put to the test in this film is what I find the moral quandary in that question of like, what do you do so fascinating? Because in a way, it's like maybe I should just arrest myself then because that is
Mm,
what these guys want, and the law is always right, and
yeah.
the law is always on the right side. So okay, maybe I should just. But he's fighting against the fact that he did save lives. Like he is an absolute hero, like Richard
Right.
Jewell, undeniably what he did to save people from that bombing. He knows that's the truth, and it's like your own personal truth pushed up against your own like moral compass is what I find so fascinating about this
It's
movie.
so deep in that sense, you know. And then I think there's more texture to this, as always in Clint's movies. I think Kathy Bates's character is very important because I think you sort of start to see the cost of all this is not just on Richard Jewell, but it's on her too, just like a normal, innocent family. And now suddenly he's at the center of the circus. And
Yeah,
I think you have to understand the the mother son relationship a little bit more as well, which is shown beautifully to
absolutely.
understand who this person is, right? Because the movie will fall apart if Richard Jewell is not a real breathing person. Otherwise,
Right.
they'll become a caricature, right? But I think that relationship between him and his mother sort of shows you this is not a simpleton. This is
Hmm.
somebody who's brought up with this kind of mindset of like, okay, you believe in these things, and then of course Richard Jewell has kind of added that to his own life, and he's kind of lived by that. I don't know. It made me reflect and think about me and other people that I know, because we all have a certain sincere kind of earnest thing towards something that, okay,
Hmm.
I'm going to do this right. And you, even though your head knows that the world doesn't work this way, you still sort of want to do it. Like, I'm going to meet my deadline because I uphold myself to this standard.
Right.
And I'm at least always sort of debating well, how much of that should I keep doing, even though I know that the powers that be all and such don't really care, you know?
Right. Right.
So,
Right.
and that's at the crux of this movie. So this is not just, somebody who feels like a simpleton in like a, not in a tier one city. This is all of us actually.
Right.
And then how the powers that be can come and exploit you and make a circus out of it, you know? I just wish that the bad guys in the movie, quote unquote, just had like a little bit more nuance, because normally you get that in all the Clint movies, and here they're just one dimensional for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I get where John Hamm's coming from, though. It's like, okay, I think we have our guy. This looks good. Let's just
I
open and
guess,
shut
yeah. I think
case. And same thing with Olivia Wilde. It's like, oh, I have a big story here. She just wants to get the
get
scoop
it.
and not really
Yeah.
about the truth as much as what's the story. But I think your point around that one thing is true. Like for me, I look at it more as like everyone has their own moral compass pointing in a
Right.
certain direction, but that's not the same direction for everyone. And you
Yeah.
see that in this movie where Sam Rockwell's like, what are you doing? He doesn't understand that Richard Jewell's Morris compass points towards the law needs to be respected, and the law will always eventually justice will be served because the law does that. And it goes to the point where he gives a speech at the end of the movie. I love the speech of Richard Jewell's like, I always love law enforcement, but I don't know if I can trust federal law. And then at the very end, he becomes a cop again. And in a
Yeah.
way, you might say, like, these are the people that screwed you. Why would you ever want to go back to law enforcement? Like that would be if I was writing a screenplay. I'd be like, okay, well now he throws like a lot of scenes, Dirty Harry throws his badge into the lake and he's like, I'm done with you guys. I'm out. The system is too much. He walks away, even though obviously he comes back later. But that would be the scene I'd write if this was a character. But instead, no, he gets tested. The law was actually wrong and trying to go after him. He knows that. It's not like he's a pushover, but he's still that moral compass, whatever his points still due north. And he's like, you know what? I'm still going to be a cop and I'm happy for him in the end. Even though
Yeah.
in a way you should be like, you should hate the law. You should be out there protesting every police and want to get everyone that they've ever put on trial free. That would be, a very easily explainable path. And that's what you'd write as a character. But the real guy, no, real people are more complicated than that. These aren't characters. And I love that ending of this movie where Richard gets to hear the real guy was caught, and there's just this sense of yes, the law does in the end work. This movie, I think, is just
It's
such an
so
incredible film.
moving, to see that he went back. And because guess what? If you truly, truly believe in something, you can't be on the sidelines, pointing fingers at it. You
Right.
have to be in it to drive change. And thank God for people like him, right? That
Mm-hmm.
who are not just like scoffing off and like running away and throwing their badge. They're actually there trying to make things better. Because otherwise, who will?
Mm-hmm.
No outsider can come and do that. It has to be from within, right?
Right.
So pretty amazing. And then the movie is cinematic. The whole bombing scene. Once again, we have like a set piece here, like the
Mm-hmm.
milieu of the place. Like it feels like a movie. Clint was not 40 years old when he made this.
No, 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 no. And the fact that he can still pull this out at that age that he was in, and even something like Juror number two is just super impressive. And I love when these guys keep working. We've dealt with a couple of them this year. Again, to middle other different successes along the way, but
Right.
these old war horses still can go out on the battlefield and deliver things. Okay, so now we're on to our final film. This is going to be your wild card. What are you bringing to the table today?
Okay, so my wild card is The Bridges of Madison County from 1995, starring Clint Eastwood, Meryl Streep, directed by Clint Eastwood, of course. Quick logline: photographer Robert Kincaid wanders into the life of housewife Francesca Johnson for 4 days in the 1960s. Yeah, this movie is a wildcard to me because of all the movies I've watched, and I've not watched all of his movies, but this kind of stands out as a true romance. But at the same time, there's just so much more depth to this movie in addition to just the romance part of it. And that's why this was my wild card. I also think I've seen Clint vulnerable, and Unforgiven definitely is
Hmm.
that. But there are moments in this movie, even though he's still very old, even in this movie, but him being so overwhelmed with emotion that he can't even look at Meryl Streep and has to turn away, or he's looking at her soaking wet, drenched in the rain with tears in his eyes. I've not seen him like that before. And it just moves me so much to see somebody who again we associate with being this sort of macho strong-willed kind of guy. And so it's a wild card in terms of subject matter but also
Hmm.
just characterization. I had to put this. Yeah, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on before we get more into the movie. Had you watched this movie before?
I had sworn that I had. Like there was a period in like right after college what I said when I started like getting into Clint and I was like Netflix DVD by mail a lot of his films. I thought I'd seen this before and I definitely hadn't. So this was the first time I had seen it. I really liked this movie a lot. I thought the movie was great. And I think you're right in the sense that while Clint has in his movies as an actor always been a ladies' man. Like he's always betting women right and left in all these movies, even into his like 60s and 70s. What was that? The Mule, he has like a three-way or something, like a movie he made
Oh
like
my
4 years
gosh.
ago. Crazy. But in this movie, he's like a romantic. Like playing a romantic lead and he's so charming. Like I can easily see why Meryl Streep's character would fall for him. But getting back to like the themes of Clint, I think what's interesting about this movie is it does play again with the theme of these moral choices around adultery this time. And the judgment that there's bookends of this film are the Meryl
Mm.
Streep's character has passed away and she left all of her diaries to her kids to go through and read. And basically, she's admitting to this affair she had years ago, very brief affair with Clint Eastwood over like a week. even though they stayed in contact for a while after that. And the kids are learning this like in real time, reading these diaries, and you see the different reactions between
Mm-hmm.
the son and the daughter of first it's immediate judgment. Oh my God, I can't believe mom cheated on dad, and oh I hate her now, and then as they're reading, you sort of understand, or they understand more why she did it, why it actually was helpful for them because it made her into a better mother, and it sort
Mm-hmm.
of gets into all those things. And by the end of the movie, while the movie's not like condoning adultery or saying you
Right.
should cheat on your spouse. It's like, look, people make decisions, and now you understand and have more empathy for why Meryl Streep made the decisions that she did, and Clint Eastwood going after someone who he knew was married, and why he made those decisions, and that you don't really judge them in the same way that anyone might by reading the facts, which is essentially what the kids see in the beginning of the movie when like, wait a second, what's going on? And then you go through that evolution, you have the empathy, you have the understanding, and then again, you're not condoning the decisions or saying they're right or wrong. You're just understanding Meryl Streep more as a person, which I think was fascinating and I think very interesting take on this, which is the theme that comes up in a lot of these types of movies. We've covered Brief Encounter before,
Right.
one of my favorite movies, also kind of about adultery. But this movie's handled in a way where it's more about the judgment and the morality of it than like Brief Encounter is more about the love aspect of it. So I thought this
Yeah.
movie was great. I really enjoyed it.
I mean, I could almost put this as a masterpiece. It was like a tough choice
Yeah,
between these two because this is sort of up there as well. I think it when I first watched the movie, I wasn't in love with the kids because I was like, oh, why do we need this framing device? And these kids are kind of annoying and what have you. But I think as I watched it over time, I think it's important for the points that you brought up to have that. But to me, the movie is very much about the love. And I think just to bring back Brief Encounter to your point, like there are a few movies in that pantheon in my mind that have shown just so elegantly and naturalistically how two people can kind of fall in love with each other despite their circumstances and
right.
anything and everything. Like it's not sensationalized that, oh, I'm this boring housewife, or I wanted more, or my husband is bad, or blah blah
Exactly.
blah, or I'm this kind of wandering person and now I've seen somebody who is interesting and what have you. It just feels just in those quieter moments and you really see that. And I think the backstory of these two people is so critical in understanding that. And it's not read to us. The characters just embody them and talk
Hmm.
about it, right? Like she did have other dreams. She comes from a different world. She's not from here. She's made a good life here, but it's coming to a point where the kids have grown up and there is a desire there. But then her system is kind of shocked a little bit by just like the way she asks him questions that, oh, you just found a town that looked pretty and you jump off the train. How could you do that?
Right.
But the truth is that that desire to live life is in her as well. And he reminds her of that, like, oh, you did do that because you moved from Italy to this
Right.
country.
Right.
You've done that actually. So, but you've just not
Yeah.
seen that side of you for all this time because you've been building a home here.
I love when he says, when he's like, this is not boring. Like, what are you talking about? Like, look at your
Right,
life. You have an amazing life. And she's not,
right.
he is able to show her that this is, and he's not just saying that to just trying to get with her or anything. It's not a
No,
pickup line. He's like, lady, like, I've been all around the world and like, you have something here. Like, I don't know why you can't see this, but let me kind of show it to you. And I think that the end of that conversation I really thought was cool. I
I
like that.
totally agree. I mean, that's the thing. Like, this movie is so beautifully written. Like, I can just listen to these two people like talk and explore, and they're questioning each other and themselves, right? And then later on, once the attraction starts to go deeper and they start to find common ground and she gets to have some fun because she's not really had that. And I'm sure he's had fun, but I don't think he's had this kind of grounded fun with somebody, and have a home cooked meal. And all these things are attractive to both people. But then I love the morning after, where she really starts to question all of it. And it's so the more I've watched the movie, I think the questioning and the finger pointing that she's doing is actually at herself. But that's
Absolutely.
not
Why
what
am I
she's
doing this?
saying.
Right.
Why am I doing this? What she's talking about is, am I just another person in the many, many number of women that you met across the world? Is this even real?
Hmm.
And can it be even real? Oh, wait a minute. Is it real? Why am I doing it? And should I be doing it? Like, it's just such a layered dilemma that she's in. And obviously, I think this is in one of Meryl Streep's like pantheon performances. Like this is like you can see her think through all of this real time, which I think is pretty amazing.
Yeah, actually, like the part of the movie it kind of took me out of it a little bit was actually Meryl's accent just
Hmm,
did not work for me at all. Like the whole time, every time she was talking, I was trying to be like, what are you okay, you're Italian, but like is it vaguely foreign? And then by the end of the movie I'm like, okay, you're clearly trying to do an Italian person who was born in Italy with an Italian accent, now been to America for so long that
right,
it's kind of still there but not really there. And
exactly.
that well, I'm like, okay, that's very got some good truth to it, but for me like I couldn't, it was hard for me to get around that with her performance. I was too distracted. And maybe the second time I see the movie
Watch it again. I think
I'll
you'll
know kind
feel
of what it, but
differently.
it's like
Yeah.
just you should have made a choice to either have a very House of Gucci accent, because at least then okay fine you're Italian, or just
No.
get rid of it entirely. Like something about this, I don't know, put a distance to me between myself and this character, because the accent was like a little questionable. But beyond that, I think she again does a great job, and I really buy the two of them together and the dilemma that Clint Eastwood's character's in too, where it's like, look, you're married, so I can't, if I dedicate my whole like, heart to you, even though I think I'm falling in love, like you're just gonna smash it. I have no guarantees of this.
Right.
Like you're the one who can't do anything. Like I'd settle down right now and be with you for a second, but like I'm too scared to kind of go that far in, because you have a escape hatch of like, well, look, I'm married, so this is over, And that
Yeah.
when that starts coming in the movie too, I really gotta empathize a lot with
It's
where Clint
another
Eastwood's
layer.
at too. It's like, oh, just because you're free doesn't mean you're free to like get your heart smashed by random women around town. So I think he that part, especially like you mentioned before, that scene of him in the rain is iconic and just so well handled. So yeah, I'm glad you put this on the list, and I think it fits in as Clint with as a director. Again, fits into a lot of these questions of morality and choices and everything that we've been talking about throughout all of his films. Even though this is a romance that seems a different genre, it is a different genre than a lot of the other movies we've talked about, and something that Clint doesn't do very often as an actor, even like a full on, this is a romantic movie. Is it just shows how much of an artist he is, because his worldview is still just like weaving into this. And maybe that's what attracted him to the book, which I've heard the book isn't very good, and that the movie actually makes the book better. I was reading some
I
reviews
see
at the
that
time because
because
I
yeah.
hadn't, like, it was kind of like a trashy book that Clint was able
Yeah.
to elevate into this more grander work. Unlike, I guess, the reviews of the Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, where they say they did the book disjustice, but just
Mm,
interesting that he was attracted to this, and maybe that's why, because of these choices we were talking about and the effects that these choices have, which you might say, oh, it was terrible she had this affair, but kids through that lens, it helps them. Like the daughter is like, you know what, I have to leave the marriage that it actually isn't working. I can now have a divorce. And the son has sort of taken his wife for granted. And now he comes back and it's kind of a little cheap. Those actors are pretty bad, to be honest.
they're
I
not good.
liked the framing, but the actors were not great. He comes back, he like kisses her really hard. It's like, I love you. I want to be the best husband. And it's like, well, that's because of a bad decision. You can say morally incorrect of cheating on her husband. But Meryl Streep saying this and actually letting the truth happen is making her kids' lives better, which I thought was a good sort of, again, reflective. Even though the choice might be bad, you could argue the consequences of that aren't necessarily bad.
And you understand it, right? And this is the thing, like Clint is still doing this, which is that he allows the story and the characters to breathe. There are no jump cuts. You
Right.
stay with them, and what that does is, of course, things can be slower, but it allows you to kind of really understand why people are making the choices, good or bad, and the consequences of those. And I mean, the scene in the car where she's almost about to leave is iconic.
Hmm.
No words are said in that scene, and I'm sure when that movie first came out people must have been yelling in the
Yeah.
theater, you gotta go, you gotta go. but
Yeah.
but I think, yeah, and there's maybe that's where the pulpiness of the book might be, but the way the movie has handled it, the way Clint has handled and the way these two leads have performed, like you are at the edge of your seat, not because will she, won't she, but the what's at stake
Right.
emotionally for these people.
Hmm.
And it's critical that the husband is a good guy. He's not a bad guy, and
Right.
you see that's what at stake. And
Hmm.
so yeah, it can be sensationalized, but the movie is just very delicate. Again, sense of place. Like I really felt like I've never been to this part of the country, but I felt like I was there.
Hmm.
And these bridges are beautiful. The heat. The sand, the farm that she lives on, like all of that just feels so real. Her house, her kitchen, all of that feels just so real and tactile. Like this is some of the best production design I've seen in
Yeah,
any movie, let alone a Clint movie.
yeah, and real because it's very ordinary and not
Yeah,
nice, not glamorized. And there's
no,
scenes where he goes in, he's like in these cafes, and there's just the townspeople. They look
I
like
love
real
those.
people. It's not
Yeah,
like, oh, from central casting, let's staff a waitress and the person behind. It's like, no, these look like you're actually in this town. And
yeah.
it's that again is something that he does so well. But definitely in this movie, I was
So
realized, oh yeah, like I feel like I'm there. Definitely transported
yeah.
for sure.
And I will say, in addition to the romance and vulnerability part that we've talked about, I think this movie is very sensual. First of all, the way Meryl is shot in the movie, I mean, she's in her 40s, but she looks so good, not
Hmm.
like glamorized or anything, like a simple person, a woman of a, middle age, but is just beautiful, but a hardy woman. Like you see her, like she's jumping off of tractors, cutting the corn in her field and does all the work and but also is sensual and sexy and is kind of coming into her own sexuality. Like he gives a lot of time to that. Like it's not for vanity purposes because she wouldn't do that, but she is kind of put aside her own desire and sexuality on the side.
Right.
And this whole thing is kind of brought that to life. Like she wants to buy a good dress, she wants to take a good bath, and these letters or the diary entries are kind of explicit, and
Yeah.
kind of a vulnerable thing to be writing in the first place, let alone to your own children. And none of
Yeah.
that is like handled lightly, right? Like
Right.
it's handled with a lot of depth and nuance, which I love. And she looks amazing. Their chemistry, I mean, Meryl can have chemistry with the lamppost, but their chemistry is amazing, even though he's so old
Yeah.
looking in the movie,
Yeah.
so old.
Yeah, I
I
know.
always forget that because by the end of the movie, I'm, swooned by their romance. But then when I watch it again, I'm like, oh my gosh, you're so old in this
Yeah,
movie,
but
Tula.
that was
But
30 years ago too. That's great. When I saw him in this, I was like, damn, you're old, but oh my God, like you know, he had a movie again 4 years ago. He's having a three-way in that movie, and but like at this point, he was too old. Like it just,
yeah,
but that's Clint, you know.
it's evergreen. What a guy.
I did the best. Yeah. So speaking of Clint, what would you like to see him do next after Juror number two?
Nothing. I think you've mounted such an amazing legacy of work and in an unshowy way. Like he's not out there like Scorsese or Coppola. Coppola has been basically on the campaign trail for Megalopolis since the last like 18 months.
Hmm.
Clint is not going to do that. And I respect him for that. So I would just say like rest and relax. That's what I think.
Yeah, for me, it's the opposite in that I don't really care what he does necessarily.
Just
I
keep doing
think,
it.
yeah, because if he keeps working, I think he'll keep being alive. I get sad thinking about a world that I walk this planet where there's not Clint Eastwood existing somewhere. And maybe the reason why he's still around at 96 and kicking and able to make movies like Juror number two is because the work is what is driving him. And maybe if he
So
did fully retire, then he would retire in more ways than one. And that is what I know at some point, obviously, that's going to happen. Hopefully, it's not for a while. And that's the only reason why I feel like I want him to keep working, just because of that. Though, like you were saying, I think Juror number two is a great. If this was the last movie he made, I think it's a great
pretty
final
good.
film, and his catalog is incredible. And in a way, actually, this episode has been interesting for me, just thinking about him just only as a director, and maybe in the future we'll do a Clint as an actor. But because he is someone who has such a enormous presence and impact as an actor, you kind of forget he's an incredibly talented director. And if he had never acted except only in his own movies, I think he would be listed as one of the greatest American directors. And people kind of gloss over that because his acting career and what he's left behind as an actor is so monumental and totemic that it distracts in a way from him being such a talented and incredible director. Like I do think he's one of the best American directors we've had in this as a humanist. Like I was saying, he's a
Yeah.
human. No director is like that, and it is easy to forget because he was Man with No Name, he was Dirty Harry, he was in Unforgiven, in Line of Fire, and all these movies where he's just iconic performances. He's more than
Yeah.
that.
I agree with you. I mean, because I've not watched a lot of his movies as an actor, like, I see him or think of him more as a director first. So I agree. Like he's
Oh,
definitely
interesting.
in the pantheon of directors. I agree. Yeah, I think movies have kept him alive and going. So for that reason. But at the same time, there's a balance there. I don't want him to hurt himself
No,
either.
no,
You
no,
know, like
no.
these sets and making movies are hard. So I also
Yeah.
want him to kind of relax and rest and enjoy, which seems like he does while he makes movies as well. Like his sets feel like the most enjoyable,
Yeah.
relaxing atmospheres as they possibly could.
Right, right. It's not a James Cameron running around yelling at everyone and like putting them in, life-threatening
No,
situations.
or David
It's
Russell throwing phones at people. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. It's a very, very different, a very, very different vibe. So, in terms of what's next, we have one more episode this year before we take our annual little break here. So, what are we giving our listeners as a final farewell to 2024?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about our top three movies each of 2024. And as a reminder, like these are not movies that were released in 2024, but it's more like movies that we saw and shaped our 2024, essentially. We will do a top three movies that were released in 24 early next year, right before the Oscars. But this is basically, thinking about movies that shaped this year for us on a personal level. So yeah, excited to share those movies with you, Alex, and also our listeners.
So, thank you all for listening today. Hope you enjoyed our discussion. Be sure to let us know in the comments below what are your thoughts on Clint as a director and maybe some of the other Clint Eastwood directed movies we didn't mention that are favorites of yours. We are available here on YouTube as well as all podcast platforms. So, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so. Also, please rate and review us, and don't forget to like this video as that really helps new listeners find our show. And with that, I will say goodbye, Karan.
Bye.